This won't, oh, this will work. Oh, here, I think to hold it. Now it will work.
So that's how I
mutes
can mute
other ones.
everybody else.
This one, and you're talking in it?
You should just use that.
Okay.
I don't disagree.
Well, if you just want to use that, then just use
Good morning. The subcommittee will come to order. We're here today to discuss the underlying trends that make the Department of Veterans Affairs information technology contracting so fraught with problems. To put it simply, the market is concentrating. Spending is going up, and the number of companies receiving the contracts is going down. The VA is not unique in this respect, but as one of the largest IT buyers in the federal government, it's a striking example of how the system operates. The system is marked by bureaucracy, regulatory capture, the revolving door, and impunity. What you will not find in this system is much accountability. This is why IT projects meant to modernize how services are delivered to our veterans stumble again and again. They're rewarded with the change orders that enrich vendors while squandering valuable and limited resources because contracts are not specific enough to hold vendors accountable. The same companies cycle through the agency year after year. Not only that, they merge and consolidate. That's becoming increasingly common. And if they fail at one project, they simply reappear in another office with a different project. They compete with each other, but they tend to operate within a closed loop. So they rarely face competition from outside the government sector, which is where the innovation is found that most people associate with technology. To be sure, once in a while, a disruptor manages to find its way through the jungle of paperwork and achieve impressive results, many times only to be acquired by a larger firm, which eliminates competition and perpetuates the problems. We should look around at the barriers that discourage new entrants or participants. One is the sheer complexity of government contracting. Another is the inability or unwillingness of agency officials to understand what the contractors are doing and to hold them to account. A third is the widespread practice of putting enormous multi-year contract vehicles in place that function as an approved bidders list. This enriches a well-placed few and shuts everyone else out. The surefire consequence of this concentrating marketplace is a widespread organizational conflicts of interest. When the same few companies work in and even make decisions for all of the major organizations within the VA, there is no way to maintain fair dealing. Either the supplier base has to expand or some of these companies have to be barred from holding certain future contracts. That is not my opinion. That is what the procurement laws say. It is the VA's responsibility to police this system, and it is this committee's oversight responsibility to make sure that that happens. American veterans and taxpayers are rightfully outraged when they read about billions of dollars being paid out year after year with nothing to show for it, to an industry that always seems to be recession-proof. I appreciate our witnesses joining us today to help us better understand the situation. And with that, I will yield to the ranking member, Representative Sherfilis McCormick, for her opening statement.
Thank you so much, Chairman Rosendale. The Technology Modernization Subcommittee conducted extensive oversight of VA modernization and IT contracting last Congress. A common thread identified was a fundamental lack of planning, budgeting, and adherence to contracting best practices by VA and its contracting centers. GAO has done an excellent job cataloging what has gone wrong in the past. VA acquisition management has been on the high-risk list since 2019. I would be interested to hear from our witness today her opinion on how much progress has been made since their inclusion on that list. GAO has also cataloged issues with competition for IT contracts, while VA's annual IT obligations have increased from $4.2 billion in 2017 to $6.5 billion in 2001. The number of companies receiving those awards has decreased. An occurring question last Congress, but continues into this Congress, is where are the checks and balances in VA's oversight of major IT acquisition? I still have not heard a good answer to this question. Whether it's benefits, financial management, supply chain, or healthcare record modernization, there is a lot of talk about following a framework and accountability, but very little evidence. As a result, I've co-sponsored Ranking Member Takano's IT Modernization Improvement Act. This will require the VA to contract for independent verification and validation for these major IT programs. Veterans and VA employees should not have to continue.
This is on our first and only panel. First, from the Government Accountability Office, we have Ms. Shelby Oakley, the Director of Contracting and National Security Acquisitions. We also have Ms. Hannah Shank, a Senior Advisor at New America. I ask the witnesses to please stand and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to provide is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you very much. Let the record reflect that all witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Ms. Oakley, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to deliver your opening statement.
Chairman Rosendale,
Deliver your opening statement.
Chairman Rosendale, Ranking Member Sherfilis McCormick, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for having me here this morning to discuss our work on VA IT contracting. VA relies on information technology systems to provide critical benefits and services to millions of veterans and their families. As a result, VA has one of the highest obligations for IT procurement in the federal government, over $25 billion from 2017 to 2021. Our work over the years has found that VA has faced challenges in its IT efforts, and more broadly, in its ability to successfully execute acquisitions. We have made about 100 recommendations in these areas, and while VA has implemented many of them, our work continues to show room for improvement. Today, I'll briefly discuss 2 recent reports, one on trends in VA IT contracting, and another on VA's efforts to oversee its IT procurements. Last year, we reported that from 2017 to 2021, VA's total IT contract obligations increased by more than half. Large technology modernization efforts like the Electronic Health Records program and the COVID-19 pandemic response drove much of this growth. At the same time, the number of contractors receiving awards dropped by more than 25%. This decrease is likely due to VA awarding 50% fewer new contracts during this same time period. VA officials told us that the department has made a concerted effort to consolidate customer IT requirements. This kind of approach, called category management, resulted in fewer, though larger, IT procurements. Our prior work showed government-wide contracting for common products and services through initiatives like category management mirrored this trend. The overall trends were also reflected in VA's IT contracting with service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses. While IT obligations to these businesses increased by almost 30%, the number of such contractors fell by 10% from 2017 to 2021. We also found that VA's IT obligations have been increasingly concentrated with a small group of contractors. Specifically, over half of VA's IT obligations in 2021 went to only 10 contractors, up from 45% in 2017. More broadly, 30 contractors received about 75% of VA's IT obligations over this same time period. VA is relying more on 2 particular contracts. Its Transformation 21 Total Technology Next Generation contract, known as T4NG, and a government-wide contract vehicle managed by NASA called SOUP. By 2021, these 2 contracts accounted for over half of VA's IT contract obligations, with VA competing orders for 90% of obligations amongst the vendors on these contracts. With the increase in VA's IT contract obligations in recent years, oversight is essential. However, in March, we reported that many of VA's IT contracts were not being reviewed or approved as required by the agency's Chief Information Officer, or CIO. This review is a key aspect of federal statute aimed at improving IT investments by ensuring better oversight of IT contracting. Specifically, we found that VA awarded almost 12,000 new IT contract actions between March 2018 and September 2021. VA did not provide evidence of CIO approval for over 4,500 or 35% of these contract actions. In particular, we found that the IT contract actions executed by non-IT focused contracting shops represented the majority of unapproved actions we sampled. We and the Inspector General have previously reported on these same challenges, but they have persisted. As such, we recommended that VA implement an automated reminder for contracting officers to obtain this CIO approval for IT procurements. This should ensure that VA's CIO has the opportunity to provide input on current and planned IT acquisitions and help avoid awarding contracts that are poorly conceived or duplicative. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sherfilis McCormick, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my oral statement. Thank you for having me here, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Ms. Oakley. The written statement of Ms. Oakley will be entered into the hearing record. Ms. Shank, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to deliver your opening statement.
Your microphone wasn't on, I'm sorry.
Now, is it on now? Sorry, okay. I've been a technologist, now it's on. I've been a technologist for my entire career, starting at Anderson Consulting in the 90s. I then started a small IT consultancy, which I ran for 15 years. It was exactly the kind of small business that government should want to work with: efficient, user-focused, and low cost. While I landed some small government contracts, I never even considered bidding on a major piece of work because responding to huge government RFPs required an equally huge lift. More concerning, the government RFPs that came across my desk seemed to be written by people who didn't know what they were asking for. After healthcare.gov failed to launch, I joined the United States Digital Service, USDS, hoping to bring my technical skills to government. But like many USDSers, I immediately grasped that the root of all government system failures was not a lack of hands-on technical talent, but the procurement process. When I was at Anderson, we were one of a number of companies competing for these contracts. But over the years, the industry has consolidated. Anderson Consulting has become the mega company Accenture, and government's requirements have become increasingly onerous, requiring specialized teams who do nothing but respond to government RFPs. Only the very largest firms had the capability to compete. According to the GAO, as of 2021, only 30 contractors accounted for 75% of all of VA's IT obligations. These big firms don't play fairly, gaming the system to elbow smaller companies out of the way, often by acquiring them. They also account for every single one of the large-scale federal IT disasters. At USDS, I worked on one of those systems, ELIS, the nation's immigration case management system. USCIS began building ELIS during the George W. Bush administration and scrapped the entire system 7 years later. By 2015, when USDS came onto the project, they found that the contractor, IBM, had designed ELIS so that it relied heavily on IBM products, even when those products did not benefit the system. As a result, ELIS took 5 times longer than paper to move the applicants through. Today, ELIS is stable and functional. The way USCIS got there was threefold. First, they extricated themselves from their monolithic contract with IBM. Next, they carved out smaller, discrete projects with clearly articulated outcomes goals, which mostly went to smaller vendors. Finally, and most important, USCIS built an in-house team with technical expertise who could correctly procure and manage IT projects. Following ELIS, USDS created the Flash procurement vehicle to encourage a more diverse set of vendors to compete. Flash failed, but other federal agencies later refined the process to successfully contract with smaller vendors. These agencies include CMS, OPM, and, wait for it, VA. VA has a procurement vehicle called CEDAR, which pre-qualified for service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses to receive task orders for IT development and delivery. There are talented tech teams within the agency who are working to get it right, but these teams are small and are often not consulted when it comes to these large-scale procurements. The way forward for VA is clear. Like USCIS did, they must free themselves from the large vendor contracts that are not serving them or their users, and relying on the expertise of their own digital service teams, work to bring on smaller, responsive vendors for discrete pieces of work. I'd like to close with a positive story. Dr. Williams is a psychiatrist at a VA in a large Midwestern city. When she first came to VA, she was delighted to find that VA's case management system made her work easier, unlike her previous experiences using Epic and Cerner. At VA, care is provided holistically, which means practitioners work together across specialties to provide the best care for veterans, and the IT system facilitates this. Dr. Williams once met with a veteran who was in the process of moving, as vets often do. Because her meds were packed in one of numerous cardboard boxes, she'd stopped taking them and had become actively psychotic. Using the VA's existing case management system, Dr. Williams was able to look up the patient's history, place an order with the on-site pharmacy for the missing medication, arrange a home health nurse to assess the veteran's new home and create a system that would remind her to take her medication, enroll her in an outpatient program so she could get evaluated the next morning, and arrange a van to transport her to a clinic near her home. The system allowed Dr. Williams to do all of these things in less than 30 minutes. The vet was able to stay out of the hospital and get on a path to health. This is how government systems should and can work. But you can't get there with a small pool of vendors who take advantage of government's lack of technical know-how to line their own pockets. VA has the chance to do something wonderful for our nation's veterans. They should take every opportunity to get it right and serve our veterans as intended. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shank. The written statement of Ms. Shank will be entered into the hearing record. We're now going to proceed forward with questions, and I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Oakley, let's start with the data points that you collected. According to your report, the VA spending on IT contracts rose from $4.2 billion in 2017 to $6.5 billion in 2021. But the number of contracts dropped by more than half, from 4,831 to 2,263. Why did this happen?
What we recognized in these trends was that VA is awarding few contracts, and they're issuing modifications or task orders on existing contracts more frequently. And so that would attribute to the decline in new contract awards. That being said, the value of new contract awards has gone up pretty significantly over the past couple of years. So VA seems to be relying on its existing mechanisms as opposed to putting in place new contracts to be able to award this funding.
Ms. Oakley, you also found that the number of companies working for the VA, which just referenced, dropped from 1,247 companies in 2017 to 873 companies in 2021. Can you explain how that happened?
Absolutely. This is a common trend across the federal government. The number of companies that are doing business with the federal government has been decreasing significantly over the past 10 years, 10, 15 years. And so VA's total number of decrease was about 25% in the number of vendors that are doing business with VA. And so that makes sense from the perspective also of VA's efforts to put in place things like category management, where they combine requirements for common products and services on specific contract vehicles to be able to get the best price and save money, operating as like one buyer across the VA and across the federal government. And so that's part of that trend government-wide.
So I understand that. It sounds like you try to utilize in the private sector the economies of scale.
Yes.
You've got all of these things, and you're trying to get it so that there's one person or three or whatever that are handling that. And in the private sector, that is used as a tool to drive costs down.
Yes.
And increase efficiencies. Meanwhile, I think we're seeing the exact opposite here. So how much of it is due to the marketplace, and how much of it is due to the VA's decisions and their practices?
I don't have data on how much is due to the marketplace for sure, but I definitely know that that is the intention of VA using contracts like T4NG or the NASA SOUP contract, is to kind of get that preferred pricing, that better pricing that comes from having that data that shows, hey, NASA's paying this much and HHS is paying this much, we should be paying this much as well too, as opposed to each individual contracting officer going at it alone. But
So-
you're right. Oh, sorry.
And again, we continue to go back to the intent, and the intent is to utilize the economies of scale. But when we look at the hard numbers and we see that the contracting went up from $4.2 billion to $6.5 billion,
Yeah.
clearly this isn't working.
Well, the majority of that increase since from 2017 to 2021 is really driven by those large-scale IT modernization efforts that we've talked about a number of times. VA has undertaken a significant number of IT modernizations all at the same time that are really driving those increase in costs. FMBT, EHRM, those kinds of things are really putting a lot of that cost increase.
And one other question, do we have any type of a breakdown, do you have access to any type of a breakdown to show exactly the difference between the cost that was contracted for initially and had it been intended to be the total cost, and how much has been added on as extras through change orders, through modifications of any form or fashion?
Yeah, so there's two different issues at play. So for like the large-scale modernization type efforts, we would be able to more easily figure out kind of what that delta is between what we expected it to cost and what it's currently costing. For contracts like T4NG or NASA SOUP or whatever, there's a upper ceiling limit for those contracts, and so task orders can be continued to be awarded on those contracts until it hits that ceiling, and then a new contract needs to be negotiated at that point in time. And so there are kind of two different issues at play.
Very good. Thank you very much. I will yield now 5 minutes to Representative Sherfless McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As is common now in federal contracting, small companies are acquired by large government contractors, which can potentially lead to conflict of interest. This has certainly been the case from our observations of the T4NG contracting vehicle, which is being used by the VA and administered by the Technology Acquisition Center. GAO's testimony and recent reports have highlighted that as dollar amounts have increased for IT contracting, at VA, the recipients of the awards has decreased. My question's for Ms. Oakley. Ms. Oakley, from your observation, has VA done a sufficient job to manage the number of companies that were on T4NG's vehicle?
Yeah, so I guess answering the sufficient aspect of that, I think, is a little bit difficult for me because I don't know what the expectation would be for the number of companies that should be on a contract vehicle like this. But T4NG is set up such that there are opportunities for on-ramping companies. And mainly those opportunities are targeted at small disabled veteran-owned businesses. And so I think those have been provided, and we've seen kind of a growth in the number of contractors on T4NG since its inception to what the current contract is as well, too. So, I think that is definitely something that we've seen. And then there's a pretty even split between small businesses and large businesses on those contracts. The other thing that I would kind of mention in terms of T4NG is that, one of the biggest benefits is saving administrative time, getting contracts turned around quickly, because that's what those types of contracts are intended to provide, that efficiency. And I think that's where you're seeing that drive and use on T4NG is that ease of use for contracting officers who at VA have to deal with, for example, applying the rule of two to every single procurement that they make.
Why does the government use category management, and what benefits does the government gain from such strategies?
Yeah, category management, as I mentioned, is a way for the government to leverage its buying power and kind of act like more of a single buyer of common products and services. And so these are things that are commonly available commercially. And so our work over the years has focused on what those benefits category management has provided. And in 2021, we reported that the government has saved about $30 billion just in 3 years through its category management efforts. So it does drive savings across the federal government. We haven't done that work specifically for VA, but we have some work coming for you all in that regard over the next year. And so it just provides the data specifically across the government to be able to make those purchases. One thing I will say that we've found to be a challenge and a continuing challenge is that defining of requirements. And, we want to look at category management as a holistic thing, not just a contracting approach. And so being able to work more effectively to define the requirements of what you want through category management will enable agencies like VA to better get what they need through these types of efforts.
We've heard of several IT products and software, including software for blind and low vision VA employees, where VA is not utilizing an enterprise contract. Is there any benefit to VA making employees purchase these items and services individually?
I'm not familiar with that contract for sure. I think when we point out one of the challenges that we've identified for VA acquisition management is contracting officer workload. And one of the things that we've seen over the years is that VA hasn't been operating as a consolidated enterprise in a number of areas. And what that has resulted in is contracting officers having a higher than normal workload, issuing individual contracts and task orders for their own purposes. And so I think to the extent that VA can operate from a more holistic perspective with an organization as big as VA, significant savings could be achieved.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Representative Mace, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the ranking member for being here today. I would like to thank both of you for showing up and taking our questions this morning because, as you know, the VA refused to show up. And just appreciate your effort to explain to us sort of the process and how it works. And Ms. Schenk, my first job out of college at the Citadel was with Anderson Consulting. Late 90s, Y2K, COBOL, C++, SQL, PHP, the whole 9 yards. That's where I got my start. So I really appreciate your perspective on government contracts and being here today. The VA's entire modernization effort requires much work, but today we're here to provide congressional oversight over the IT contracting process, and GAO has determined the VA to be a high-risk agency, as you all have stated this morning, because it has among the highest obligations and number of contract actions in the federal government. This extremely high number of contract obligations requires constant oversight to ensure the American taxpayer dollar is being spent in the most efficient way possible, and that veterans are receiving the best services available. And sometimes when I'm talking about IT in the VA, my head wants to explode because of the number of contracts, the lack of oversight, the lack of actually following the process and the rules by the VA. I sat in on a women's veterans roundtable yesterday, and I appreciate the comments about the example, Ms. Schenk, that you shared about a veteran who didn't have her medication and then was able to get it in record time. But there was a woman at the roundtable, and she needed just her annual pap smear. It took 6 to 8 weeks to get scheduled. Once she got scheduled, it would take another 4 weeks to get her results. And, we still have such a long way to go to care for our veterans, and we can't even get their records, electronically, or they can't. So, and I come from a long line of veterans in our family, and, I hear about these issues all the time. I hear success stories, but I also hear about a lot of failures, and we have 1/3 of all veterans in the state of South Carolina live in the district that I represent. So we hear from vets day in and day out. But Ms. Schenk, my first question to you this morning is, how do we increase competition with some of these contracts? How do we push the VA to do the right thing in this regard, to do better, more, faster?
So there are really two key points. One is that, as I said initially, the contracts, these giant monolithic contracts, will never succeed, and they will never serve veterans or the VA. The only way, this is, from your experience at Anderson, that was how things were built in the 90s, but the industry has moved on, and for the vast majority of the private sector, they're not building stuff that way anymore. It's not a giant waterfall process with a big bang turn-on date. Everybody has learned that the way you build tech successfully is to chunk it up into small individual pieces and then build incrementally. So the first piece is not writing these giant contracts and allowing, which is going to allow more vendors to compete, but also is the right way to build technology. And then the other piece is that because government has outsourced all this technology for so long, there's a real lack of tech expertise and tech fluency. And I'm not talking about people who can code. I'm talking about people who have some understanding of how technology works and the decisions that they're making and how that then impacts the end user. So most agencies, I would say almost all, are very, very thin with top senior people who have some degree of tech fluency. Part of that is, well, a large part of it is that technology has only evolved in the last, let's say, 20 years. So if you were somebody who was interested in going into government, you are a policy person, and you know about policy, and you know about law, and you might not know about technology. But the world has changed. And in the USCIS example that I gave, Leon Rodriguez, who was running that project, had been a policy person his entire life. He was running USCIS. He did not have tech fluency. And so when contractors would come to him and say, should I do A or should I do B, he didn't have the full understanding of how that was actually going to play out for users and for the project. And he talked about that he wished he had a technology translator who could say to him, okay, so this is what they're asking you, and here are the ramifications. That's not a position that exists in government. These agencies are slowly trying to staff up, but it's lacking. And until that skill set exists in federal government, these contracts are just going to continue.
Thank you, Ms. Shank. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Mace, and now on to Representative Sill. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Ms. Oakley, is this issue that you're describing here across the federal government as a whole? Is this just a microcosm of what you see?
I think to some extent, yes, right? I mean, overall, as I mentioned, we've seen a decrease in the number of companies that want to do business with the federal government. We see continuing mergers and acquisitions amongst all the, major federal contractors. Ms. Schenk was exactly right. When a, small innovative company is there, they get bought up by the big guy.
And that's part of the American dream.
That's what happens, yes.
Is a lot of this you ascribe to COVID-19 IT? Was that a one-off, or is that translatable into the post-pandemic era? Is this something that was a one-time shot?
Yeah, so a vast majority, a big majority of the spending increases that we saw was due to addressing the COVID-19 pandemic and providing technology and that kind of thing. We did run the numbers for FY22 because our report was done in FY21, and it seems as though the trend is continuing. And so we haven't been able to get behind the data yet because we just did it to support this hearing, but it seems as though VA's kind of trend of increased IT spending is continuing.
I'd like to see that when
Okay.
you get a handle on the numbers.
Absolutely.
So for Ms. Schenk, we have this problem, I think, in DOD, for instance, the Defense Industrial Base, procurement in general. And I realize that's manufacturing versus service, that's IT versus manufacturing, but you've told us what VA can do. What in general can Congress do, though? Because as I said, selling your small company to a large company is part of the American dream. We're not going to stop that. So how does Congress, what would you recommend that Congress do to fix these issues? We've talked about the issues. Now, you're talking to a legislative branch. What can we do that does not inhibit the American dream and yet moves in the direction that the two of you both have indicated would be positive?
One of the big issues is that there's no accountability for these large companies. So acquiring things is fine. yes, a lot of people build a company so that it can get bought, and that's fine. The problem is that that they're not held. So these companies fail, and then the contracts are renewed. It's the same 10 players. When you talk about, I mentioned healthcare.gov, Oracle. I talked about Ellis failing IBM.
Okay, so how would we do that? What does accountability at the congressional level look like in your expertise?
Yeah, so there aren't, in these contracts, there are no outcomes that are specified. In government, delivering the product is the end. You don't have to deliver it well. You don't have to deliver it in a way that improves accessibility. In the private sector, there are metrics that you would use to say, did this achieve our goals? But in government, the goal is very often just launching the system and not how well it performs and what the outcomes are. So
do you recommend something other than indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts?
Yes, I think that in general, contracts that specify outcomes are successful, and that's been proven there are multiple smaller contracts where government has specified you need to move X number of people out of beds and into homeless people out of beds and into shelters or into their own homes, and that's how we'll decide if this was a success or not is the product on and functioning.
So we've got accountability, we've got outcomes. Okay, here comes the tough question. The EHR contract. Is that even breakable into smaller contracts?
Absolutely. Even as I was kind of just doing some digging around how people use the system, I started thinking like, oh, okay, so you would, in a normal scenario, you would break this up into the scheduling contract. And so you can break these things up into individual pieces, discrete pieces. Every big tech project is, I don't want to say break-upable, but it can be divided that way.
Ms. Oakley, what's your opinion of that?
I agree completely. We've done a lot of work on the practices of leading companies that do product development for cyber products as well as cyber physical products. And we are completely in line with Ms. Schenk in terms of these companies take an iterative approach to the development. They measure their expectations for their pieces that they're chunking out. They call them minimum viable products. So it's like, okay, we can achieve this in this time frame, and it provides a useful capability to a customer. And that's how they do their work.
My time is up, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative. It sounds to me as we're sitting here talking that if we had smaller pods or components which communicated with each other seamlessly, that therein is the other component, that they communicated with each other seamlessly, that we could get these systems working. But the problem is we have people that are putting the requirements out that aren't really familiar with the application, okay, how it's going to be utilized. Or as I love to quote Dwight Eisenhower, farming looks very easy when you live 1,000 miles away from a cornfield and use a pencil for a plow. And they are just completely out of touch with what's actually going on. The other thing is that while we talk about the American dream, and I really agree with Representative Self that it is to take a small company, grow it, sell it to another company, or just grow it big by acquiring other smaller companies. In the private sector, that doesn't happen unless you produce a successful product. And that's not what is happening with the VA right now. Ms. Oakley, you determined that 10 companies received nearly half of the VA's IT contracts during these 5 years, worth $12 billion. What are those companies, and is that typical in a federal agency?
Yeah, so I have the list here. The top 10 companies are Cerner, Government Services, Denali Holding, Booz Allen Hamilton, AT&T, 4 Points Technology, Leidos, Veterans Tech LLC, Liberty IT Solutions, which was actually acquired by Booz Allen Hamilton, Nestor Consulting, and Accenture. And so I don't have the government-wide data to know the concentration for contractors government-wide, but we did crunch some numbers for you all in terms of professional and support services contracts, and it seems to be about the same, about in the 40%-ish of all obligations are concentrated amongst 10 different contractors.
So, Ms. Schenk, how does this concentration affect the results we see on VA IT projects, and do you think that that's healthy?
The concentration is absolutely the opposite of what you would want to see for tech development. The issue is that there are fewer it goes back to, again, why are these giant contracts being written? The only companies that can compete for these giant contracts are these same giant companies, which is how you keep getting these repeat offenders. In the private sector, most places have brought this work in-house, so they are not hiring these giant companies. Government made the decision not to bring that, has not thus far brought a lot of that tech talent in-house, so they're the last man standing when it comes to these giant contracts.
So let's look at the top 3 companies. Excuse me. The first is Oracle Cerner. Excuse me. EHRM has clearly been a disaster, and I expect to see significant savings squeezed out of that contract. A system we have not talked much about is the HR Smart, which is decades-old human resources software from Oracle, PeopleSoft, that VA is abandoning. I'm not going to disclose VA's cost estimate to purchase a new HR system, but it is significant. In your experience, how well do such large one-stop shops for different kinds of software, for example, medical records and human resources, tend to perform compared to specialized software companies?
Not well. These companies operate by building in their own proprietary tools, and then they live off of the licensing contracts, and they are able to lock themselves in so that no agency can free themselves from this contract, and they have to keep just re-upping and modifying whatever the tool is that they've bought to try to serve their users. A smaller vendor who is specialized would build it right the first way. They don't already have an existing thing that they're trying to cram in to work for this particular product.
Let me ask you something. If we look across the VA system, we've got our 179 medical facilities. Do you think it would be more effective and efficient to try and develop a electronic health record system and also a management system for the facility, or is it going to be more efficient to develop a system for each one of the components, for the pharmacy, for the records? And then either which way, that's got to be seamless, that they can work across the spectrum.
Well, as my co-person here testified, you want to build a minimum viable product. This is how technology is developed. And so what you are describing is the correct way to develop technology, where each one of these things would be developed separately with the understanding that they would roll up into one large system, but they all have to do different things. They might have different users. Their goals are different. The outcomes, in theory, if there are outcome goals, they would be different for each one of those individual pieces. So they should be developed separately, tested, and then rolled up into a larger system.
And I understand that, but I'm trying to get to is it the site with all its components that should have a separate system that can communicate with the other sites, or is it each of the components within that site, whether it's scheduling, whether it's prescription drugs? So should each of those components be different, or should it just be the site itself?
Each of those should be developed individually.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Representative Sherfless McCormick, I yield for 5 minutes.
Thank Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Oakley, as you've noted in your testimony, VA acquisition management remains on this year's high-risk list. VA acquisition management has been on the list since 2019 and in fiscal year 2022. VA obligated $56 billion for goods and services. Before we dive into the IT acquisition component of this, I would like to ask you about the progress that you feel the VA has made since last year's report, if any.
Yeah, we did report progress that VA made. In particular, we focused on leadership commitment. We do see a commitment from, for example, the Chief Acquisition Officer in the organization to making improvements with regard to VA's acquisition management efforts. We also noted improvement with regard to their action plan. That's what we say is required to be able to kind of outline the steps that you're going to take to improve in this area. VA has also implemented a number of our recommendations over the past couple of years, so they are moving in the right direction. The action plan itself does outline a number of really significant efforts that have to occur to be able to drive improvement, and no pun intended, but now we just need to see action on the action plan.
Thank you. Also, Ms. Oakley, I know that in the report, GA makes reference to VA's efforts to implement its new acquisition framework. We've now seen the completed negotiation for the continuation of the Oracle Cerner contract, and we've heard that the VA has plans to move forward with a contract for supply chain modernization sometime soon. Are you aware at all of how the VA has used this acquisition framework to manage and prepare these acquisitions?
I'm not aware on the EHRM program how the acquisition lifecycle framework or the draft framework contributed to how they negotiated that contract. The framework is broader than just the contract. It's the approach to the program. And so I would hope that as that framework rolls out, that VA takes some significant steps to adjust the management and oversight and execution of that program to be in line with what's required of their draft framework. With regard to the supply chain modernization, as we understand it, VA is trying to use the acquisition framework as a test bed, or the supply chain modernization as a test bed for the acquisition lifecycle framework. I don't have any information, nor have I reviewed any documentation that would give me an indication of how indeed they're doing that. And VA recently provided us some information on the supply chain modernization efforts that are moving forward, but I'll look forward to seeing how those principles from the acquisition management framework are being applied, and we'll definitely assess that.
I think we're all looking forward to hear about that. Our committee has received a number of concerns from industry on the current plans for supply chain modernization, as well as concerns for inside of the VA on the current strategy. We have learned from the past decades of failed IT modernization attempts that at the very least, a project that is of scale should have cost and estimated, a defined scope, and a schedule. Following on your work on high-risk lists, are you aware if the VA has completed any of those requirements for the supply chain modernization?
At the last hearing I was at, I think Mr. Christie testified that no, they had not, in terms of especially the cost estimate. And at that time, and I will continue to reiterate that, a good cost estimate, a defined scope and schedule, manageable requirements are all keys to establishing a sound business case for moving forward with a program and an acquisition and a related acquisition. And so I would expect and hope that VA has done that, but as I've cautioned before, VA often puts action ahead of strategy. And we recommended that VA do a comprehensive supply chain management strategy to be able to drive the approaches that it's going to take for contracting for this. That's not complete yet, but that acquisition is in the process of moving forward for the actual system itself. And so that gives us a little bit of pause of, is this the cart before the horse again?
Well, I have one more quick question. Would you recommend VA move forward with the contract competition without those basic items?
I guess I would say it that, our work has found that those items are critical to that business case that I've talked about. And if you don't have a sound business case, this is where we have seen those failures that we have been talking about in the past. And so if they're not in place, I would be hesitant to suggest that this was a sound proposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Self, recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just point out that in your testimony, your written testimony, you noted that the VA has implemented 24 IT recommendations since 2010. They've not implemented 22. Now, I understand you have no authority to force implementation, but I just want to note they have not done 22. Now, do you agree with Ms. Shank that in-house management, project management, I think is the way she would describe it, is the way to go?
I think it's necessary that the government has in-house expertise to be able to effectively oversee these very complex procurements. for
Okay,
sure.
now for VA, let's remember they used to do their own construction. And I believe the overruns on one particular, I've forgotten where it was, Colorado or somewhere, the construction project management was taken away from VA and given to the Corps of Engineers for this very reason.
Yeah.
Now, I realize it's different, but do you stand by your in-house recommendation, knowing that VA could not manage their own construction projects?
I think maybe we're talking about two different things.
We are.
And so I would say that, there was a pendulum that has swung, right? Like the government used to do everything itself, right? And then at a period of time, it swung to hands off, contractors are going to be doing this kind of thing. I think there is a happy medium that requires the government to have expertise to understand what it's buying, what it's getting, and what its customers need to be able to put in place contractors, the private sector, to be able to do those things. And so I think it doesn't mean that, VA has to go and build these systems itself. It means VA has to know what it wants and to be able to determine if it's getting what it wants.
Okay. Ms. Shank, would you describe to me what this in-house office looks like?
Of tech expertise.
Correct.
So it's really that program management layer. The issue is that the distance between policymakers and what gets delivered is too great, and you can't have that in technology. That distance needs to be shrunk. So there needs to be a senior level of people who have tech fluency who can manage these projects, not, in like a code review kind of way, but just in a general strategy. Here's what we want our users to be able to do.
So is this at the VA level? Is this at the VISN level? What level are you discussing?
It's at the VA level, in the CIO's office, let's say.
Okay. Again, so you think that this is action, and I'll ask both of you, action that Congress ought to take to redesign this infrastructure?
I think that this is not an issue that is unique to VA. This is across every federal agency. So I'm not an expert on what Congress can do, but if there are levers that Congress can use to ensure that there is that there is a senior level of tech fluency at every agency, that would change things immensely.
Ms. Oakley?
I guess I would say, some of the things that Congress can do is support workforce initiatives that bring highly skilled folks like that to the government. I think we've focused on this in the past with cybersecurity, for example. And so those are the, kind of actionable things that Congress can support to say, okay, VA, we need you to get this expertise in-house to be able to execute these programs for us to get what we want out of them.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative. I still want to highlight some of the issues that we are facing and the amount of money that has been thrown at this problem. We talked about Oracle a moment ago, but Mrs. Shank, the number 2 vendor is Dell, which VA mainly uses as a clearinghouse to buy different companies' software. Number 3 is Booz Allen Hamilton. Here's a partial list of the major contracts Booz Allen Hamilton has held. The Veterans Benefits Management System, which cost about $1 billion. It was rolled out roughly a decade ago and is in widespread use, but it has limitations that the VA is still struggling with. The Forever GI Bill IT system changes that failed and delayed veterans' housing stipends in 2018 that cost about $12 million before the plug was pulled on that program. the Program Management Office for the DMLS Supply Chain Project, which spent at least $230 million before it failed last year, and the EHRM Program Management Office, which has produced terrible results and has cost at least $728 million. We are talking about massive amounts of money that have been thrown at IT. Ms. Shank, in your experience, is it normal for a company with this track record to appear to and reappear on so many different projects, and why does this continue to happen?
Unfortunately, it is absolutely normal in government that this happens. This happens time and again. There was a very public example in Rhode Island where the state had a public benefits application that they were rolling out. They'd contracted with Deloitte. It had been under construction for a long time, cost overruns, it failed, and the company that they hired to fix it was Deloitte. In part, that's because it's such an enormous, again, there are only a certain number of, the way that contracts are currently written, there are only a certain small handful of companies who can meet the requirements and can bid on those contracts. So what you get is just these repeat offenders. There's no accountability, and they continue to get hired.
Yeah, so again, if we compare it to the private sector, while it is the American dream to grow a big, large company, that usually comes with success because you have had satisfied customers, not all of these failures that have been demonstrated at someone else's expense. Mrs. Oakley, I understand agencies do annual past performance evaluations for every contract, and those ratings tend to be wildly out of step with the actual outcomes of the projects. Why is that, and how does this perpetuate failed projects?
We have definitely reported in the past that there tends to be a lack of frank performance information provided in some of these systems. I haven't dug into the reasons for that. If I were a betting person, I would say that contracting officer workload probably drives a bit of that phenomenon. But for VA in general, our work showed that indeed they actually overall for IT contracting had about a 96% rate of actually entering the performance information into the system, which is better than some agencies. But we didn't assess the quality of that information as well too. And if I can just comment really quickly on the government plays a role in ensuring success of the programs. And so when we're talking about the contractors and their performance, when they're being approached with these gigantic programs like EHRM, like FMBT, that are trying to be like the supply chain modernization efforts, that are trying to be the be-all, end-all of everything, right? That is the problem, right? The requirements are unattainable, and so these contractors sign up for these things, right? Because it's money, you're signing up to do these contracts, but the requirements just aren't executable in the way that they're structured, and so then it kind of snowballs from there. And that's where the kind of smaller, more manageable chunks of requirements and capability is so important that the government approach contractors with, because you would get that performance and then you wouldn't be locked in to staying with that contractor for the continuation.
Sure. So I also, this committee has heard about the VISTA system and how the veterans facilities, divisions all across the country, still have that as their backup, that it is a system-wide program that everybody is still falling back on. And so I would like to try and figure out how we can somehow incorporate any additional components that are missing from VISTA that we are trying to provide through Oracle. Representative Sherfless McCormick, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yesterday, we had a full committee hearing on issues with tracking of supplemental funding provided by Congress during the pandemic. The Inspector General recently released a report stating that because of the 30-year-old financial management system, which has not been updated, the manual journals were required to document spending. This, of course, provided problematic because of the lack of guidance provided to employees on how to document the spending. The Financial Management Business Transformation Program is meant to update the system, but to date, our committee has seen increased timelines proposed for implementation at VHA. My biggest concern is with the program now is that independency that has been identified by VA with the Supply Chain Modernization Initiative finalizing their plans for a future solution. The interdependency between large IT modernization programs seems to me to be a major risk factor for the successful IT acquisition. Ms. Oakley, who is responsible for coordinating the timing and planning of these large acquisition programs?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different officials that are responsible, which I think is part of the problem. But, you know, in theory, the Chief Information Officer is responsible for reviewing and approving VA's entire portfolio of IT acquisitions, right? And so they should have that insight. That being said, the CIO isn't an acquisition professional, and so you have the Chief Acquisition Officer that also has to, you know, be able to understand what is going on and ensure that the contracts are being structured and executed in line with the strategies that the CIO has put in place. And so as we've kind of talked about before in prior hearings and we've reported a number of times, there's a bit of a fragmentation of leadership within VA for, you know, managing and executing large acquisition programs.
Now, are there any other entities that you believe play a major role in those large contracts also?
I mean, well, Chief Information Officer, Chief Acquisition Officer, the CFO, obviously, you know, is going to have to play a role from a budgeting perspective. And so those, you know, at the highest level, those are the folks in the positions that, in theory, should be driving, you know, those decisions.
And do you have any recommendations on how we can streamline so they're working together instead of the fragmentation that you proposed, that you talked about?
Yeah, I mean, they have devised a number of governance boards where, you know, I think as I've said it in the past, it's kind of an approach of we're going to all just agree and hopefully it works out and make decisions that way. But having that kind of belly button person who gets to say, no, I've taken all your inputs of all the experts and now we're going to go this way, I think is an important thing. And one of the bills that we talked about in the last hearing was that Chief Management Officer bill that you had talked about, that you had that we had been proposed. And so, you know, that's a role that position could play in making sure that those investments are coordinated.
And has the VA been receptive towards addressing the fragmentation?
I think to some extent, you know, the kind of development of those governance boards and whatnot, and through the acquisition lifecycle framework, the draft acquisition framework that they're hoping to put in place, that does drive a little bit more accountability and responsibility for decisions throughout the acquisition lifecycle process, which goes just beyond just the contract award. And so I think they're taking steps to bring more kind of rigor and discipline to the approach. But, you know, we haven't seen wholesale change quite yet.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative. Representative Self, recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we're getting to the bottom line issue, which is a government-wide issue. Not only the U.S. government, it's every government. How do we instill accountability? We can go around and around on this, but the fact is the government has no profit motive because in private sector, you know, you have a measurement in place. You either make a profit or you go out of business. We don't have that in government. So we have rent seekers. People who want the advantage to get all of the government contracts that you ladies have been describing. I still am wrestling with how do we put accountability into this, because we can add a layer of bureaucracy, which we've suggested here, but because we have no profit motive, I'm still wrestling with how we get to an outcome-based system. Because we're spending a whole lot of taxpayer dollars here. And we're not, I've not heard of anything yet that gives me the confidence that we have any outcomes, because we've used the term, but I think this committee ought to try to get at the baseline here of what we need, and that's outcomes. In an IT system, it looks to me like you would have a list, and maybe Ms. Shank could weigh in on this. you would have a list of outcomes that would be generic enough, that would be across the systems without saying, you got to have this field in this form. So I would be interested in that, if you could give us an idea, because to me, that's the bottom line. How do we get to accountability, outcomes, without just adding a layer of bureaucracy and saying that's going to fix the problem? Because I don't think it ever fixes the problem for us to simply add a layer of bureaucracy. Ms. Shank, would you care to comment?
Yeah, so there are well-defined outcomes for how these systems should perform that are used in the private sector. And those are always human-centered outcomes. So the humans at the end of the system, are they able to achieve what they need to achieve within a reasonable amount of time? Sometimes that could be something like saying no one should wait more than 5 minutes to find out, if they have an appointment, or nobody, and it's not only the IT, it's also, nobody should wait on the phone for more than 5 minutes before talking to a person at wherever, right? So if you center the humans in the process in thinking about the outcomes, the end goal of these systems is to serve people. Are they served efficiently, correctly, and in a way that, and accessibly?
But, okay, but that's below congressional level. That's in the VA level. So I guess I'll continue to wrestle with it. Ms. Oakley, would you care to comment, please?
Yeah, I would just say it may not be necessarily below congressional level, because you can require things of VA. And so when you're talking about, she's talking about the human-centered, our work on, product development of leading innovative companies shows that the customer is involved from the very beginning, and the customer is providing input and feedback and responses that then shape the continuing effort. And so it's not just, do we get to the end and does it meet their needs, right? Because that would be too late to do anything about it. And so when you're talking about what could be required of VA, it's that, like, how do we document, how does VA document in any acquisition that it does, how the end user, the customer, however you want to define it, is involved in the process all along the way to ensure that we're establishing the right requirements, we're focusing on the correct minimum capabilities that we can get out there first based upon what's needed, and that in the end, it's going to provide a useful outcome to those folks.
I would like for you to provide the ideas to my staff, because I don't want Congress in the project management business, but at the same time, I'm wrestling with how we get to this discussion. How do we get there? Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative. I would like to go and dig into a little bit more about the VISTA system, and I understand that you aren't necessarily, professionals on VISTA, but you sure understand the basic technology. Does either one of you know how long this VISTA system has been in place? Since the 80s, okay. So that one has certainly been tried and tested, shall we say, and a lot of the warts have been worked off of it. Is it accurate to say that all of the current VA facilities use this system around the country, including those that are currently being forced to use the Oracle system? Is it true that they still have VISTA running in background?
I believe that's true, yes.
Okay, I mean, to me, that should be startling to everybody in this city to think that we have a system that was developed in the 80s that is basically the primary system that we're using for electronic health records, and yet we are spending billions of dollars with another contractor, with another vendor, that has not provided us the results that we need, and yet this one is still working for a fraction of the cost. Does anybody know what components are necessary to fulfill that seamless, operation that we were talking about earlier, so that everybody can still communicate with each other? But do you know what components are missing from VISTA that we were trying to achieve by bringing in Oracle to replace them?
I don't know that specifically. I can get that answer for you off the record, but I do know that, we've talked about the medical supply chain and the challenges with using those types of systems for the medical supply chain. And it's, antiquated. It doesn't provide the right kind of data. It doesn't give real-time information to be able to manage, a supply chain at any given medical center, let alone, nationwide like we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic. And so there's various aspects of VISTA, I think, that affect the efficiency and effectiveness of, operations within the medical centers, from, finances to contracting to, you name it.
And the very prescription drug issue that you spoke of earlier, Ms. Shank, it's my understanding that that is one of the main components that we were having problems with, the Oracle system, that the pharmacies within these veterans facilities, they were having major problems with that, and risking lives and the health of our veterans.
I'm not aware of exactly what the issues are with Vista that requires the upgrade or the replacement. I do know that if you have an immensely complex system that users like, you want to try to keep as much of that functionality as you can. So the idea that a contractor would come in and just throw out a system that has good pieces to it is sort of anathema to how you develop technology.
So maybe we should actually be talking to the farmers that have a plow instead of the people that are using a pencil, and finding out exactly which components are missing, and maybe we could introduce those into the VISTA system, and we could actually deliver something that's working for not only the facilities, but a lot better delivering benefits and services to the veterans.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. I will recognize Representative Sheriff McCormick, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Takano has introduced, and I've co-sponsored 2 bills this Congress. One which would require independent verification and validation of large IT programs like FMB and supply chain, and other which would establish an undersecretary for management at the VA. Ms. Oakley, you testified at our legislative hearing on both of these bills, which were very helpful, and we look forward to incorporating GAO's comments into our final version. Has GAO identified any other issues with VA acquisition management that needs to be addressed with legislation?
At this time, there aren't any outstanding matters to Congress with regard to that we've identified with regard to acquisition management. I think, we need to see VA take action itself first to really address those root causes of its acquisition management problems. And, those root causes are outlined in that action plan I mentioned. And so again, taking action on the action plan will get VA moving in the right direction. And then I think illuminate any areas that the Congress needs to act on that VA can't do itself.
Given recommendations that are outstanding with VA around acquisition management, what should be the priority for VA to address making sure near-term programs like FBT and supply chain modernization don't suffer the same fates as previous attempts?
Yeah, so I'm just going to put a little plug in. I think our priority recommendations letter to VA will be issued next week. And in that letter, we outline what the recommendations the Comptroller General of the United States thinks are the highest priority for VA to address. And there are several that are related to acquisition management, including addressing the acquisition workforce challenges that we identified in a report last year. That kind of the comprehensive supply chain management strategy, developing that and executing that as well. And then we have some recommendations related to actually assessing the acquisition function within VA to understand where improvements need to be made. And so those are just 3 that are outlined in that priority recommendations letter.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Self.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we know, the EHR system is paused. I've asked previously the cost to upgrade Vista versus Cerner. Can you walk me through the steps, Ms. Oakley, to cancel the Cerner contract? How difficult is that? What are the steps? What would that take?
Well, the government can cancel any contract at its convenience at any time. And so that the process for doing that, I think, would obviously involve some pretty significant steps, but it's well within the government's rights to be able to do that for sure. I can get you, for the record, the actual process and what that would take for sure, just to give you a little bit more detail on that.
Is there a huge buyout?
There's usually a limitation of liability on every contract that should be outlined in that contract to give a sense of what the government would be on the hook for. Typically, you know what, I'm not even going to make a guess because I haven't looked at that EHRM contract recently, but I can get back to you with that on what that, termination liability might be.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative. Thank you very much. The panel is excused from the witness table. And with that, I will yield to Ranking Member Sheriff-List McCormick for her closing statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the testimony and answers from our witnesses this morning. I think it was a good start to a much larger discussion to continue with VA this Congress. Competition in contracting is a positive thing, and we need to incentivize this at the VA, where dollar amounts have increased. They have continued to see poor performance. Employees, veterans, and members of Congress have had enough with the current lack of success, and I look forward to working together to ensure we have more positive outcomes in the future. Thank you so much for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Sheriff-List McCormick. I want to sincerely thank our witnesses for joining us this morning. Ms. Shank, I know you had to travel to get here, and I appreciate you putting that effort forward. Ms. Oakley, you've appeared before this committee roughly a dozen times, and I certainly appreciate your dedication. I expect the VA to provide the best qualified witnesses upon request when we resume this discussion of this topic in the future. I intend to stay focused on these issues for as long as I have the privilege of chairing this committee. Not only are the veterans unable to see the results from billions of dollars that are invested in IT, but the VA is becoming an increasingly difficult place for most companies to do business. Government contracting is supposed to be a level playing field. However, the VA has become a notoriously difficult, arbitrary client. We want the best companies with the most innovative ideas working for the VA. But those companies are hardly hurting for work, and I'm sorry to say they are looking elsewhere. This situation is guaranteed to produce more bad outcomes, and I expect to hear how the VA's IT and contracting leaders are going to fix it. With that, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material. Without objection, so ordered, and the hearing is adjourned.